And at 1:30, a really fascinating look at the coastline of North Devon in our popular series of programmes that's aptly entitled About Britain. At 2, we turn our attentions to comedy American style with Just Our Luck, and at 2:30, it's drama once again with Falcon Crest. But now here's Jill Neville with Thursday's A+.
Hello and thank you for joining us. Our guest on the programme today is His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, who's come into the studio to talk about his new book, Man, Machines and Sacred Cows, a collection of some of his speeches made over the last 30 years. But, Your Royal Highness, you make, I think, in the course of a single year, anywhere up to 80 speeches. So how did you decide what should and shouldn't be in the book?
Well, I didn't. It's very simple. The editor, Sinclair Stevenson, came along and said, could we, put a book together? I said, well, help yourself. So I gave him the accumulated rubbish of 30 years, and you can see how much he thought of it. He reduced it to that.
But a book like this is a very personal matter. Didn't it worry you what went in and what didn't?
No, not really, because it's all been out already. I mean, if I was going to take any kicks, it was all been published. I mean, I said it all. The only thing that obviously you have slight anxiety is that whether anything that you wrote 30 years ago is still relevant today. Mm-hmm. Because I do sympathize with sort of aging politicians. They keep tripping up over quotations, which
I think the other thing that surprised me was that, unlike those aging politicians, you write most of your speeches yourself, whereas they often leave it to private secretaries.
Well, I wouldn't know. Yes, I do it myself.
I mean, is that stern sense of duty, or is it because you want to say something particularly?
No, it's just, I don't know, it just seems to be the obvious way of doing it, I think.
But it must be difficult for you, of all people, to write speeches and to keep them relevant and meaty, which you do, when you're so close to the sovereign and have to be necessarily apolitical.
Oh, but there are an awful lot of subjects that are apolitical, if you come to think of it. In any case, political means of public interest, put it that way. And there's an awful lot of stuff which is of public interest, which is not party political. I mean, it's not partisan, and provided I keep off subjects which are currently in dispute between two political parties, and I'm reasonably safe, I think.
You talk there also of that it's not just you for whom there are taboo subjects. You talk in the book about the general ones and how they've changed since Victorian times.
Well, I didn't actually say that particularly. I think, yes, there are... I don't think I wasn't really talking about taboo subjects in the sense of things that are not polite conversation. I think they certainly have changed, yes. You can say things now which I dare say 100 years ago people would have fainted dead away. Now, I think that taboo subjects are really things that, like sacred cows. I mean, the media is a taboo subject as far as I'm concerned, because the media has practically no sense of humour about itself, so it's very difficult.
So you're saying that we are one of your sacred cows in the book?
Well, you're a taboo subject.
Are there any more that I can push you into talking about?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons they're taboo subjects is that I don't talk about them.
Right. So much for the sacred cows. Let's move on to
the sacred cows are all different. Those are things that you daren't talk about. I mean, daren't criticise, put it that way, because they're they're elevated in the public mind. They've got a sort of status which is simply unassailable, and therefore you must on no account say anything about them. I mean, I suppose the obvious sacred cow is, let's say, the National Health Service, because it is there, and you're probably much safer not to say anything about it.
Let's move on to the men in the title. One thing that comes through very, very clearly is your concern that the individual shouldn't be lost in the bureaucracy of state. It is something you feel very strongly about, isn't it?
Is that very unusual?
I think you have it's a particular hallmark, actually, of your writing, this concern for the individual.
Well, I mean, you've only got to travel about, and you've only got to see what has happened in other countries, and what the consequences of dictatorships. In a sense, is this in a sense, the philosophy that individuals are there for the sake of the state, and I think that seems to be wrong to me. It seems to me the state is there for the sake of the individual. People they've got very good intentions. They feel that they know better, but in a way, I don't think if you have a system in which people are not actively involved and don't, when I say actively involved, are not considered in any way, as if the significance is the individuals in the state rather than the state is more important. I think if you always keep saying that it's in the public interest that people should behave in a particular way, you end up by being pushed around because somebody decides that I know what the public interest is, you don't, therefore, you're off to prison or whatever.
You say what people need is also a sense of purpose. I mean, by that, do you mean control of your destiny in the way that you were just saying just then?
No, not necessarily control of your destiny, but at least some idea of what it is you're trying to achieve, or where you're trying to go, or what you're trying to make of yourself, and what part you're playing in the community. I think an awful lot of people, you tend to arrive in a situation as you grow up, and there is the community, and there are all the constraints and the systems, and you sort of take it all for granted. And then the tendency, I think, is to become very selfish. And you forget that, or you don't even realize, perhaps, that the community is that way because individuals are making it that way. And instead of, therefore, I think people tend to try and take advantage of it or kick it around because they say, well, it doesn't really matter. What influence do I have on it? But the fact is that it's the combined effect of a lot of people having some idea that the only way you're going to get a satisfactory community is if we all muck in together and make it more satisfactory, and somehow have a feeling that, well, even if we don't make it particularly satisfactory for ourselves, there's a chance that if we do it right, it might be better for our children or grandchildren or whatever. Instead of saying, after me the deluge.
But you also quote the French philosopher Pierre Chardin saying mankind is bored. Do you think that's at the root of quite a lot of problems today?
Well, we're now jumping slightly because that was to do with the use of leisure and discretionary time. And I think he makes a very good point that he says idleness is the mother of all something or other. I can't remember exactly what the quotation was. But I think idleness leads to boredom and leads to, I don't know, trying to fill boredom with something. In other words, trying to fill this sort of blank with every kind of thing. Whereas I think that if you think about leisure or discretionary time as something which you can use to your advantage or to the advantage of the community, I think you then get a different picture.
But a lot of us, I think, still have very Victorian attitudes
I don't believe it.
Well, I think they have.
Speak for yourself.
All right. I have a Victorian attitude that work is good and what I do in my spare time is fairly incidental. Do you think that'll change, or do you think it's changing?
No, I think work is good. I don't think that's not quite the same thing. I think that what you do, I don't think is necessarily as important. I mean, I don't think to judge people by their jobs is rather a limited way of judging the individual, because it's what a person is. I mean, what he's altogether. And in many cases, what people do in their spare time, in their leisure time, is more important than the work that or more important, it is more significant socially, let's say, than their job. I mean, take, for instance, there are a lot of people in local government who may have relative unimportant jobs. I mean, when I say unimportant, I mean they're very important in what they're doing, but they're socially not all that important, maybe employed in the factory. But in their elective job as a local councillor, of course, they're far more significant. They may be more significant, for instance, a factory worker, maybe secretary of the local football club, for instance. Well, socially, the work he does as a secretary of the football club may be voluntary, is in a sense, from the community point of view, far more valuable. And I think that people ought to be judged much more by what they are and how they behave and what they do in their, in a sense, discretionary time than necessarily entirely on the basis of what they do to earn their living, which may be not frightfully significant.
But do you think then that our schools should be taking note of this and actually educating people to make use of their spare time?
Well, I think a lot do. I think traditionally, of course, the schools that have the or feel or have the time certainly do that. I mean, There are all the extracurricular activities, the clubs and societies and things of that sort. But I think the difficulty with so many schools today is that there is such a pressure on acquiring particularly intellectual qualifications, which then somehow or other will qualify you for entry into certain jobs. But of course, the way in which you do the job very often depends on many other things, on what sort of person you are again.
Nevertheless, I think you also said, and I hope I'm not misquoting you, that there isn't enough attention paid to character building because people aren't going to get civilized values just by trial and error, or it's going to take a long time.
Well, I never referred to character building because it somehow sounds as if it's rather like brainwashing or something, as if you can create, because people are very often going to be what they are in spite of practically everything you do to them. I think that they should be exposed to much greater experience, in a sense, where they can find out from themselves what's good, what's bad, what's interesting, what's damaging, and so on. So I think it's not so much character building. I think it's allowing people to develop by, in a sense, both self-discovery and discovery of what goes on in the world. I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm connected with that do exactly that. There's the award scheme, for instance, which is the whole basis of the exercise, is self-discovery. There's the outward bound schools, there's the Sail Training Association. They're all really doing much the same thing. They're trying to give people the opportunity to discover for themselves what life could be like.
Let's move on now to the machines of the title, and most of the book is in fact devoted to this, to science, technology and industry. What was it that first attracted you to this apparently unglamorous subject?
Your prejudice is showing.
I should tell you I'm a scientist.
Why did you say that's unglamorous?
Because I hoped I'd get a reaction out of you.
Oh, no, I didn't. I think it's... no, I wouldn't have said it was unglamorous at all. In fact, I think a lot of science is very glamorous. And some scientists are very glamorous, too. I don't know. Partly, I think, because in the early days I was got at by Sir Harold Hartley, who persuaded me to take an interest and said, you know, you can do a lot by visiting research laboratories and encouraging scientists and so on. So I sort of went along with that. It seemed very interesting. I mean, I'd been in the Navy for whatever it was, 12 years by that time, and I'd had quite a lot to do with I suppose, technology. So it wasn't total mystery.
I think it was Sir Harold Hartley, too, who persuaded you to address the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And that's a very august body.
Well, he persuaded me to succeed him as president, no less.
But you were 30 years old when you first made a very major speech to that body. You'd just come off, I think, off the Magpie, off your ship. It must have been
Well,
quite...
I wrote most of it on board. Yeah.
It must have been quite a daunting experience, was it?
It was, yes. But, I mean, he kept saying, you can do it. And I'd sent him a lot of drafts of what I was doing, and he suggested ideas and so on, so that it was very much a joint effort. Yes, it was daunting, but of course it was, it wouldn't have happened but for the fact that it was in 1951, which was 100 years after the Great Exhibition, and also 100 years after, I think, Prince Albert had been president. So in a sense there was a kind of excuse for it. As long as I acted more or less like a ventriloquist dummy, it wasn't too bad.
But you still seem to have kept... Actually, I'll take you up on that, because they say... I got a review here in the day after, and far from being a ventriloquist dummy, they say, had many trenchant things to say about industry and British education. That's the News Chronicle.
No, that's a long time ago. I don't remember what I said.
But anyway, through the years, you seem to have kept this interest in science, both of its importance to society and also of its dangers.
Well, yes, I think that... I mean, almost everything we do, it can be dangerous, and it can be beneficial. I mean, a very simple one is nuclear physics. You can use it to create power, which is very valuable, and you can use it to make a dirty great explosion, which is perhaps not quite so valuable. And I think almost anything in genetic engineering, you can imagine it being used for the wrong purposes. In chemistry, you can produce toxic chemicals, or you can produce drugs that are good for health and so on, safety. So I mean, I think almost everything we do has dangers, risks of being used in the wrong way.
The difficulty, though, surely is where you put the constraints, because scientists, I think, might argue that knowledge is pure, and it's the application that's the problem.
That's right. It is. Knowledge, yes, knowledge is pure, obviously, but the application, I think the problem with application is that it's not a thing that you can decide on a purely rational basis. You've got to have some kind of, I don't know, moral or ethical perception which will actually decide for you that, yes, I will do this because I believe it's the right thing to do and the good thing to do. And equally, you may say, well, I'm not going to do this because I believe it's the wrong thing to do. But there is no rational decision about what is right and wrong. It's a thing that, it's a kind of moral concept which you have to develop.
You also identify in the book, though, a wider problem of this gap between science and the decision makers, i.e. the industrialists or perhaps politicians, and their tendency to regard science and industry and engineering as something apart.
Well, I think that's true. I honestly don't quite know why. I think it's partly because the tradition has been amongst administrators in this country. They're drawn basically from the intellectually gifted rather than the either mechanically or scientifically gifted. And I think there's a certain anxiousness about not quite understanding what it's all about. And I think that leads to a certain suspicion. And I think, funnily, there is a peculiar thing in this country, unlike, let's say, Japan, where in a sense, the Whitehall-Westminster axis is always in a confrontation situation, or appears to be, with the industrial-commercial axis. And whereas instead of, in a sense, cooperating in the interests of the state, they feel themselves in an adversary situation. But honestly, it's difficult to know why.
There's a fault too, though, on the other side, isn't there? Because scientists, and to some extent industrialists, have this obfuscating language. I mean, they do speak in terms which is very difficult for the rest of us to understand.
Well, so do administrators.
Well, that's certainly true. How is it, though? I mean, do you think it was your background that shielded you from the traditional British, and indeed particularly aristocratic landowner prejudice against science?
I'm sorry, because...
Why do you think, well, what I'm saying, to make it clear, is why do you think you are open-minded, whereas so many other people are not?
Well, it's got nothing to do with my background, I don't think. I mean, I was just trying to think, but I've spent all but the first 7 years of my life, and 1 year at school subsequently, I've spent in this country, so that I don't think I was particularly shielded from anything. Oh, I don't know. Perhaps it's because of the position I got put into. If you start in a service existence, you're not committed to either side, and then again, in the sort of peculiar position I'm in, I don't have to identify with one side or the other.
I must cover myself, trying to intimate that you were a foreigner, but it did strike me as...
No, I'm a refugee.
Right. Yeah. As quite remarkable that Prince Albert should have identified precisely the same problems 100 years ago, that technology and industry needed boosting in this country, and that arts and science needed to be pulled together.
Yes. I think he made, he was more specifically concerned with art and engineering, as it were. I mean, more than the deliberate development of science and technology. But I think that he was a supreme intellectual, in the sense that he could visualize things in a very rational way. And I think that was his advantage. In my case, I don't think I ever worked it out particularly rationally. It seems to be a much more practical point of view, I think.
Now, among the many things you've done this year, you've also, and last year, been patron of the exhibition of Prince Albert, the Royal College of Art put on. And I know you don't invite comparisons at all, and I slightly tremble, but one of your biographers has said that when you became engaged, you read as much as you could about the life of Prince Albert. I
think he was looking at himself in my position. I think he would have done that. I didn't really know. It's not strictly true. I mean, I was interested in, generally speaking, in what happened in those days, but no, I didn't make a particular... There wasn't really very much time either.
But you have given, haven't you, even though you've said constitutionally I don't exist, you've given your role as consort, which is a difficult role, considerable thought as to what you should be doing and shouldn't be doing.
Well, I never thought of it as a role. I mean, it's just a way of life, and it's just, I just got on with what seems to be the sensible thing to do under the circumstances. I mean, I don't visualize myself as playing a part.
You nevertheless, forgive me, do play some sort of role. You do have one function anyway, as I see it, among many others, which is to help promote monarchy and the image of monarchy, and to look after it very carefully.
No, you make
No?
it sound as if I was some sort of PR agency. No, no, I don't. In fact, I'm very doubtful about the whole concept of deliberately trying to create an image, because I think that it's very easily rumbled. I think that an image develops out of what you do. If you don't wholly believe in what you're doing, I mean, you can't create a different image. And so I think the only thing to do is to get on and do the best you can with the facilities and in the circumstances, and hope you make a reasonably sensible judgment. But not to do it with a view to, well, what effect is this going to have? Except in certain limited sense. I mean, obviously we're talking about the encouragement of engineering and science. Then obviously you go out and say, well, yes, the object of taking an interest in this is to promote engineering and science or something of that sort. And the same thing with let's say, fundraising or whatever it is. You go out and deliberately do something in the hope that people will take an interest in it and then produce some funds.
But all the same, I've lost my way. What was I going to say? You've actually put me off entirely. What I was looking for was you must, doing so much, really sensible, hard work things, it must be very irritating to you that so much press coverage, so much of the media coverage is of gossip and trivia.
Well, it's irritating, no. I think it's, well, the methods they use are pretty irritating, yes, in many cases. There's sort of staking out and something, and sort of obsessive, I don't know, sort of show operation. I think the comments very often are, I don't know, no, not irritating, but disappointing in the sense that, you know, you begin to wonder what goes through their minds if that's all they can see in it. That's why, again, we're going back onto a taboo subject.
That's true. My taboo this time. But one of the things that must give you a certain amount of pleasure during your time is the increasing awareness of conservation that there's been.
Yeah, it's not in that book. That's in the conservation addresses and things are in a separate book that was published.
I think there's a short chapter which gives me a little room for pulling it in. Because it is a very important thing today, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think so. I think that anybody who lives in the country, and if you pay attention, you tend to see in microcosm some of the things that are going wrong, and then you gradually begin to realize that these are multiplied, not only in this country, but in Europe, and then in the world at large. And I don't think that, how should I put it? I mean, if you're interested in natural history at all, it's very difficult not to be concerned about what's going on.
You've said, though, that you couldn't face your grandchildren if conservation failed. Have you got anything particular, I mean, any particular species or perhaps a particular sort of landscape that you have very close to your heart?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think the more you move around, the more you see, and the more different landscapes have I don't know, and make an impression. I mean, you go to the Antarctic, I mean, I wouldn't like to live in the Antarctic possibly all the time, but I mean, it is very spectacular. The Himalayas are very spectacular, the deserts, the seas are very spectacular. You know, they've all got their own kind of features.
And of course the rainforest, particularly at the moment.
And the rainforest, which are very difficult to see, because if you're in them, you can't see very much, and if you fly over the top, you don't see very much either.
Now, I know you hate suppositions, but just suppose for a second that your public engagements after this interview decided you weren't going to have any more of it.
Drop dead, I mean.
Not at all, no, just decide to retire and resign. What would you like to be remembered for?
Well, it doesn't really concern me very much, because when I drop dead, I mean, I'm not going to be around to find out what people do remember, so it doesn't really bother me all that much.
Isn't there anything, though, that you're particularly proud of having achieved?
No, I don't think so. I think keeping out of trouble, I think, probably.
But now, over this 30 years or 40 years that you've been on the job, and observing British life, writing about it, do you think at the end of that more optimistic or less than when you started out?
Well, I don't know. I didn't quite know what to expect, I suppose, when I started out. I think, no, I'm optimistic, basically, because I've got great confidence in, I don't know, the sort of basic British character, because if you look back over the last 1,000 years or something, that we've somehow always, whatever difficult periods we've got into, we've somehow or other got out of them again, and people have settled down and they've got over their divisions and got over the sort of arguments and that sort of thing, and we've all started again. I think that I can't say that I'm particularly happy with what's the sort of life in this country at the moment, but I don't think anybody would ever make much comment if they were happy with the thing. They'd just become a sort of vegetable and sit there saying how marvellous all this is. There is an awful lot which is marvellous, but of course inevitably, if you're paying attention, you see the things which are unhappy. I mean, no one can sit around and say that the whole of the sort of inner city problems and these big city problems and conservation problems and unemployment problems, you can't say that there's a very, it's not a very happy situation. And of course, it's difficult at the moment to visualize how we're going to get out of it, because a lot of it has been the consequence of things that have happened before, and we've simply got to live through a difficulty.
Your Royal Highness, I will never do it again, but I'm going to have to interrupt you. We are out of time. We've run out of time. It's been a great privilege and pleasure to talk to you, and thank you on behalf of all of us for coming into the studio to A+ today. Thank you.
Tomorrow morning at 20 to 8, Christopher Reeve flies into TVAM studio to reveal everything you ever wanted to know about Superman. Followed at 5 to 8 by superstar Boy George with one of the most popular videos of all time. At 8:15, we'll be asking how Princess Diana gets on with the rest of the royal family, and what does the future hold for the next Queen of England. And of course, Super Rat will be live at 9 to round off half-term. That's a Super Friday morning tomorrow on TVAM.
And back to the PM part of the day, and next this afternoon, the jury decides at the Crown Court.